Right, welcome everyone to today's Lunch and Learn webinar, Rapid Sales Process Design, brought to you by Archer Point and C5 Insight. Many sales professionals have their way of doing things and may have seen some success. However, the reality is to achieve sales success year over year and to consistently improve your win rates, you have to have a sales process, one that is designed to be in alignment with your current and future customers. We're honored to have with us today Jeff Abels, author, speaker, entrepreneur, and international thought leader on customer and employee engagement. His insights have been seen and heard in dozens of global venues, including National Public Radio, Business Week, USA Today, Euroforum, the New Zealand Direct Marketing Journal, the Direct Marketing Association, Digital Summit, and in boardroom briefings across the country. He is the author of The Luck Principle, Business Results at the Intersection of People and Profit, and is a prolific blog writer on topics related to leadership, customer and employee relationships, and the future of work. He founded C5 Insight, a customer and employee engagement consulting firm in 2002, and has consulted with hundreds of companies in a broad range of industries. In today's webinar, Jeff will share how some of the best-in-class sales teams design processes. He will explain how to develop a process unique to your organization and map it to your CRM solution. He'll also provide tips on how to get your team on board with following the process. And again, we've provided a guide to assist you through designing your own sales processes, our process available in the handout section of your GoToWebinar console. Without any further delay, I'll send it over to you, Jeff.
Okay, thanks so much for that introduction, Suzanne, and thank you everybody for joining us today and for being a part of the presentation, whatever part of the world and whatever time of day you've carved out to make this happen. I know everyone's got about 1,300 things to do these days, so carving out time for one of these is an important educational opportunity. So with that said, let's dive right into the content a little bit more here. If you are so inclined, feel free to get social today. There's a few hashtags and Twitter handles you can use if you'd like to. I always like to be able to interact with people that way. Suzanne already gave a lot of background into me, so we don't need to go into any of the detail on that. But I do want to remind you again to please download the workbook from the interface, the GoToWebinar interface. If you're having any difficulty with that at all, you can also use that URL at the bottom of this slide to go get that workbook if you'd like to. This is the basic version of the workbook, so we do these sessions with clients. We also do paid public types of sessions, and then this one is our 1 hour webinar and sometimes a very small group focused one that you can grab the workbook for. So I think you'll get a lot of engagement by using the workbook. I'll reference it throughout this, but there's also bonus material in the workbook that we're not going to cover today. So you'll definitely want to have a copy of that so you can read over some of that as you get into thinking through your own sales process a little bit. So here's our agenda. You can read over that, but before we jump in, I'd like to get to know you guys just a little bit better. I've kind of seen who's attending in terms of the companies represented, but understanding your role a little bit would help out. So Suzanne, if you could pull up the first poll, that would be great. So help us understand a little bit more about your role within your organization. Do you tend to be more over multiple different groups and you're looking at how this can apply to different groups you might manage? Are you very sales focused but in the management arena there, so trying to look at this for your entire team? Are you an individual rep? Are you in IT and supporting folks in sales, or are you in some other part of the organization? So hopefully I've called out the right poll here. Suzanne, if you wouldn't mind going over those results, that would be great.
All right, looks like the majority of our audience today are in information technology. Thank you everyone for your responses.
Great, thanks everybody for that. So that's good. You guys are looking for ways to better engage with your sales teams and potentially other teams. These process design tips can work for others, but we're very sales focused today. And help us understand your situation, Suzanne, if you can pull up the second poll, around CRM and your sales process today. So do you have a CRM solution? And if so, are you using it for sales process as the first one? Maybe you've got CRM, but you've not touched sales process yet. Or maybe you don't have CRM, but you do have a sales process, and maybe you don't have either one. So I know it's hard to hard to not multitask today, but I'd ask that you guys go ahead and toggle over to the application if you're just listening and just give us a quick one-click answer to that so we can understand just a little bit more about you and your organization. And Suzanne, when you're ready, you can review those results.
Yeah, the results are in. It looks like the majority have CRM but no sales process.
Okay, good. So you're in a good place. You've got a CRM solution. You're looking to get sales process integrated into it. So our mission today is to enable you in a little less than 1 hour, and I do have a hard stop right at the top of the hour here, to develop a basic sales process. I know that's a lofty goal. In fact, it's probably impossible. Most organizations spend somewhere between a half a day and a few weeks ironing out what their sales process design looks like, but at least we want to move you closer to that and get you started, give you a solid push and a few of the right tools to get you going. So we're going to give as much to you as we can in this hour as to move you towards the process as possible. So what I'd ask you to do right off is open up your workbooks. You're going to be looking at page 3 of your workbooks to start with. And if it's just digital, you can write the notes somewhere else. But quickly write down in that first column what sales teams you have in your organization. So you might have someone who does more inside sales versus field sales. You might have people who manage distributor relationships versus people who manage direct customer relationships. You might have sales teams aligned by product groups. But whatever individual sales teams you have, just fill that in. Write those down real quickly. And I'm going to pause here for about 30 seconds and give you some breathing time to write that down. Okay. I don't know if that was 30 seconds or not, but we'll say it was. So the first thing I want you to do, don't worry if you can't keep up with the exercises. We're going to go at a very fast pace. But I would ask that you choose one and only one of those sales teams that you want to model the sales process for. That doesn't mean you can't model out a sales process for all of them, and it doesn't mean you might not be able to develop a sales process that can fit multiple ones. But what we have found time and time again is if you try to do this across multiple teams at once, you lose focus. And usually when you lose focus on sales process, you actually lose productivity and efficacy with your sales process. In other words, you really have hurt the whole idea of developing a sales process in the first place. So you want to be painfully focused to start with and then expand out later. So I challenge you to put just one team in here. We, by the way, just did consulting for a team who insisted on, they wanted a sales process that ranged from lead generation to sales process management across multiple product groups and industry focuses to project management after they closed the sales process. And they unfortunately lost focus as a result of that. So again, I'd implore you to be painfully over-focused rather than under-focused. The next thing you're going to want to do in the next column is list the sales processes that selected team might be in charge of. So if you've interviewed that team, if you haven't, then know that that's part of the homework you need to do. But what are the existing processes they have? So examples of those could be something like, hey, we have this order entry process, or we have this 5-step sales process that takes people from pre-qualified to qualified to who knows what, but sort of a prospect to new customer conversion. You might have an account management process. You might have a sales team who has a lot of focus on managing activities, not necessarily a pipeline. So whatever their current processes are, that's what you want to list there. And again, I'm not going to provide as much time this time, but I challenge you to say choose just one of those processes to start with. You can come back and add the other ones later, but you need focus for what you're doing. And for today's exercise, or if you're going to try to roll this out to your group, what I'd also challenge you with is think about pipeline management. Think about opportunity management. If that's going on, that's what you want to focus on relative to what we're going to do today. Not necessarily that's the only thing to focus on, but that's what this content is built around. Okay, on the next page, and I'm not going to spend much time on this. The next page of your workbook, I'm not going to spend any time on. When you look at page 4, there's this idea of your USP, if you've ever heard of that. That's called the unique selling proposition or unique selling point. And the idea there is to develop one for your organization or discover what that is for your organization already. If you don't have one, that's a red flag that maybe you don't have enough focus to really develop a highly defined sales process. So it's worth going through the time to do that. We reduced it to just one page in your workbook. This is something you can spend a lot of time developing, and it's certainly always an ongoing process refining it. But we wanted to challenge you to do that because we think that that's something important for you to understand. But again, we're not going to ask you to do it today. We're going to move on to the next slide. What you might be asking, especially with a large preponderance of IT people in the group, is, hey, why do we even need a sales process, or why do we need a new sales process at all? We get asked that a lot, and it's actually a valid question. Is this whole idea of sales process really going to help us move the needle, or is it just something extra that we need to do? So study after study has shown that if you get sales process right, you really can accelerate your growth beyond your competitors. This is research from Sales Management Association. I actually just saw a separate piece of research from HubSpot where they not only looked at the sales process statistics, but how you meet together internally to discuss sales process, how you train on that, and how all those things can combine to improve results. So study after study really does show that sales process can make a difference. But what I'll also tell you is, as an organization, the organization that I run, we focus a lot of our time and effort on becoming experts in what we would call failure, and that is, why do these things sometimes not work? And what I can tell you is if you do sales process wrong, you can actually hurt profitability overall. The way one of our clients put it to us after they've been working with the sales process for a couple of years is, we discovered that our salespeople are, quote, good Boy Scouts. In other words, they were doing exactly what management and leadership were telling them to do, but when they finally started breaking that down and looking at time series studies and benchmarking how much they moved the needle with sales, what they found was they weren't moving it at all, and there was even evidence to say that maybe they were taking time to do things that weren't helping the sales process, therefore losing opportunities because they weren't doing the right things with their time. So word to the wise on this, just because you see a statistic that says sales process can and will improve growth, doesn't mean it will if you don't do it the right way. So what we want to do is get a lot of the hints in place to help you do it the right way, but we also want to communicate that it really does make a difference. Commit to it and know that it's going to be a little bit of trial and error to get there, but also keep it really simple. So we'll talk about some of those practical hints towards the end of this then. Now, all of your customers are on a journey, and ideally the goal of sales and marketing is that you will get invited to be a part of that journey, short term to have a chance at bat, long term to have a long-term ongoing relationship with customers. So all of these 6 phases, just about every customer in every industry, you could say, goes through these phases. If you start doing customer journey maps, and if you're a decent sized organization, that's going to be an important part of mapping out your sales process. We're not going to talk about that today, but if you start doing customer journey maps, you'll come up with your own phases. Each of these phases in and of themselves can be a separate sales process. So let's take a look at what those might look like. First of all, for those of you who are familiar with CRM, it sounds like most of you are. I think you said most of you have CRM, you're just not using sales process. If you think about how these phases fit into a typical CRM solution, the first couple of phases tend to focus on the lead, someone before you've ever had a relationship with them. The next couple of phases tend to focus on the opportunity. You've identified a potential way to do business together, and you're moving that through the pipeline. And the last 2 phases have more to do with account management and how you're going to care for that customer over time. So some other ways of thinking about that are below that. One thing that surrounds all of these and really brings them together is this idea of activity management. And what we find oftentimes is, particularly for manufacturers, sometimes they jump into opportunity management when they've never really done that before because they have a new CRM tool that's an exciting tool for them to use, where really most of their workday needs to be run by being more proactive and focused on activity management. So one of the things I want you to know is that is a viable first step. That's not the step that we're focusing on today because most organizations really want to know how to do this idea of sales pipeline, funnel management, or opportunity management. So that's going to be our focus. But I would challenge you to think through where you are right now as a business. What we tell people is if you don't have CRM at all and you don't have a pipeline management process, Do not do both of those things at once. It's too much change, too fast. It's one of the key reasons why CRM and sales process projects can fail. Either start with sales process and say, let's start managing that, even on a tool as simple as Excel, or start with CRM, which is better yet, but focus on the things your sales team is already doing and help them to become more proficient and productive with those existing tasks so they start to get value out of this new technology. Use that to get them to the technology learning curve and then start to focus on sales process. So think about as you get into this, are we a little bit too early for this? Should we focus on something else before we dive deep into this? Do we maybe need to come back if we're using CRM and we're struggling with adoption? Instead of trying to get them to adopt a new process that they're not doing at all, maybe we need to assess what their existing processes are, better represent those in CRM and train them on them, get adoption of those, and then add this new thing to it that will add even more value for them. Okay, so back in your workbooks, you can look at page 5 as I go through this slide if you want to. This is a great, simple way to start defining your sales process. It's almost ridiculously simple, and if you don't know the answers to these, you may need to get with your internal sales partners to help to explain these things to you. But just start free-form brainstorming some of the things you do at the beginning, middle, and end of the sales process. So you'd list things like, here's actions we typically take, here's data we need to collect, here's documents that need to be written or signed, or maybe marketing collateral that should be shared, or just other steps that happen during these stages, without confining your thinking at all to naming stages or anything like that, or even trying to sketch out a schematic. Just kind of, hey, in general, at the beginning, here's what we do. In general, in the middle, here's what we do. In general, at the end, here's what we do. There might be overlap between those a little bit. Don't worry about that right now. Just use it as a brainstorming tool to get started. Now, usually if I were running a real workshop, I would spend a little bit of time allowing you guys to fill this in, and we'd actually put Post-its up on a Post-it board up front to have people share best practices and ideas so that we can all get onto the same page. Right now, I'm just going to talk you through it. If you're jotting some notes in there as we go down, power to you, that's great. If you're not, you've got the workbook. You can go back and fill that in after we're done with the webinar today. Now, the next thing you want to think about, not in the workbook anymore, although I think there is some space to take some notes on these concepts, is what does a successful sales process look like? Look, typical business practices, like the practices you find in accounting, IT, operations, production, those are a little bit more like train tracks, right? They can change over time, but they're really meant to be pretty consistent over a pretty long period of time. So it's metal on metal if you want to change directions or you want some agility there. It's a little bit rigid overall. And most salespeople, when they have this processes designed and delivered to them like that, they will ultimately tell you this is either over-engineered or overly rigid. I can't flex with it. I'm in a straitjacket. I can't do the things that I'm supposed to do as a salesperson. On the other hand, many companies make the opposite mistake. They look at sales processes like they're the Wild West. There's no tracks. There aren't even well-worn paths. Every person is kind of feeling their way through every relationship. Every man and woman is for themselves. They're on their horses and just kind of going wherever they need to go to get the deal done. So in these cases, they've swung to another extreme. It's way too flexible. There's nothing you can do to actually embody best practices. So the best organizations that we found who have adopted sales process but have adopted it well, they've figured out the intersection of those two extremes. So we kind of use this tire analogy to talk about it because they tend to be flexible at the edges like a tire. So there's roads out there that they can ride on, but they need the agility to quickly turn and navigate those roads. They need to bring in that human-only element that you can't automate, the things that helps you understand a person's situation and their context and specific things that they need. On the other hand, there's enough rigidity at the core that they can make processes that are repeatable, improvable, measurable, and scalable. So we call that having RIMs, that are repeatable, improvable, measurable, and scalable. If your processes don't allow you to do those four things, they're really not a process. And the whole value of a sales process is being able to say, look, I want to be able to add new people and more rapidly bring them up to speed because we've got a process that's already institutionalized that they can follow. And I want to be able to troubleshoot my process and constantly fine-tune it. And if I don't have something in place that's repeatable and improvable, measurable, and scalable, I really can't do that. The interesting thing is that flexible edge, that edge that gives individual reps some sense of empowerment and the ability to make some of their own decisions, that's one of the sources of innovation. Because when you come together for your regular huddles or sales meetings, people are trying new things that they have the flexibility to try out there on the edge. And when they discover something that can work for everybody and share that as a best practice, if you have a good sales structure in place, you can easily add that to the process over time. So what you're looking for is this balance, and you want to be aware of traditional process design where it becomes overly rigid, over-engineered. I see lots of company leaders doing this, saying, hey, in my executive position, here's what I want to know about the process, versus way too flexible. And I see a lot of people in the front lines doing this, saying, I don't want any restrictions at all. I want this to be wide open. You need something that is a compromise between those two things. What we suggest people do is really focus on keeping it extremely simple and more flexible at the beginning. Not completely flexible, but we call it the cringe factor. So you don't want to cringe because you're concerned it's too complicated or too rigid. You want to cringe because you're a little bit afraid it might be a little too flexible and a little too simple. It's easy to begin to add complexity once you've started, but if you start complex, it is really hard to then simplify down from a level of complexity. So start simple and build out from there. So what are some other practical tips about what should be included in a sales process? How do you walk this balancing act of having enough rigidity but not too much, enough flexibility but not too much? If there's one thing and only one slide you remember today, this is the one to focus on. This is how the winners, the folks who really do get good adoption and see the revenue needle move as a result of sales process, develop effective sales processes. And it universally applies. These rules apply to virtually any people-facing or customer-facing thing. In fact, if you take your highest performing sales reps and really break down what they're doing these 4 things really well. So if you look at these, the 4 Ds, breaking them down, number 1, they gather data. Like they know how to capture knowledge about other people, who they are, what they want, what they've purchased in the past. For big companies, that's big data. For small companies, it can be a little bit simpler. Part of the data gathering is usually good integration with your accounting and other systems, because the best predictor of what someone's going to buy in the future is what they've purchased in the past. So integrating your CRM with your other data systems is pretty important. Under decisions, they use the data to make decisions better. They use it to make decisions about how they're going to approach the client or prospect, how they're going to qualify them, and they spend a lot of time, pursuing them. So the best sales reps actually are really good at making decisions early in the process about this person or this company is not going to pan out for me. I'd rather lay them aside and pursue more serious opportunities. That is one of the key deliverables of a good sales process, is helping salespeople to make better use of their time by disqualifying opportunities that really shouldn't be in the pipeline at all. The longer an opportunity sits in the pipeline without closing, the more time it's wasting and getting in the way of other better opportunities. The third area they focus is on delivering the right things. They give their customers what they need to answer their questions. So they think about what is data I need to capture, what decisions do I need to make, and what are the deliverables? How will I engage with this customer? Is it fact sheets from our company? Is it proposals? Is it something else that I need to deliver? In fact, some organizations make discoveries as simple as, hey, when customers come to visit us at our office, our close rate goes up much higher than if they don't come to visit us at our office. So one of the deliverables we want to do is an office visit if we can get them to do that. Another big deliverable can be samples. A lot of organizations really thrive on getting samples out there and following up, and at the right phase of the sales process, that can be really important. So they think about, now that I've gotten this great data and I'm making good decisions, what do I deliver to advance this process? And by the way, what does the client deliver to me? So great salespeople and great sales processes don't just say, give, what do we give? They also say, what are we going to agree to at each step of the process? What are we going to get the client to agree to at each step of the process to make sure that we've qualified them to move forward? So that agreement might be something like, they have agreed to get their boss on the phone on the next phone call. They have agreed to give us a letter of intent, a non-binding letter of intent to move forward to the next level, whatever that happens to be. And then the fourth area where the folks who do this really well focus a lot of time is on what we call development. They're always developing a better way to go to market. How can this process be improved overall? So CRM and this process becomes part of a sales meeting cadence where you can look at the process and say what's working, what's not, how do we fine tune and continue to move forward and forward and forward, always improving. Now, if there's another way to think about this universal set of relationship principles, we call that the LUCK principle. Listen, understand, connect, and know. And really it's saying the exact same thing that I said before. We just use slightly different words for the sales process. If you look at page 6 of your workbook, that's defined in a little more detail there. But one thing to think about as you think about your sales process is, okay, now that I've got this new framework for what we need to do during each stage of the process, what other things might I have overlooked in that first brainstorming I did that I can now build into each stage of this? I'll give you a tool in a couple slides you can use to dive a little bit deeper with that. Now back in your workbook, now that you have done some initial brainstorming and you've looked at the LUCK principle and maybe done a little bit more brainstorming with that to refine things, the next step is to name your stages. So we call it the beginning and end are defined by the middle. Now, here's something you might be looking at right now. Wait a minute, Jeff, there's only 3 stages there. We're more complicated than that. I know that we need to have more stages. Or maybe management is telling us we've got to have at least 4 or 5 stages for them to have any insightful information coming out of this thing. What I can tell you, having done this a lot of times, is if this is your first time doing it, you really probably want to stay focused on just 3 stages to start with. You can add more later. You can get more complex and sophisticated, and you probably should get more complex and sophisticated. But it sounds like everyone in our audience today are folks who are saying, we have CRM, we don't have a process in here. What I would implore you to do is focus on just 3 phases to start with. So now that I've given you that sales pitch, let me back up and talk about what do I mean about the beginning and the end are defined by the middle. One of the big things that causes sales process to fall apart is a lack of knowing where one phase ends and the other one starts. So, for example, I've seen folks do things like say, we have qualify, and then we have propose, and then we have negotiate, and then we have close. Well, where does negotiate end and close begin? An optimist might start close really soon. A pessimist might leave it in the negotiate phase for a long time. So one of the keys to successful sales process, particularly in the earliest instances of it, is make the divisions between those phases and the time when you need to move it from one phase to another, make that crystal clear. Leave nothing to the imagination with it. And if you can start with just 3 phases to start with, you can accomplish that relatively easily. So if you look to the bottom right of this particular slide, you'll see some suggestions. Let's look at the middle first. One thing we found is true in almost any sales process anywhere is at some point, usually towards the middle, you have to provide a price. That might be called a quote, that might be called a proposal, that might be called an estimate, that might be called something else. But in general, ultimately, the reason you're involved in a sales process is you have to provide a price. Now, if you provide the price and you close the deal immediately on the phone, you might not really have a sales process. You might just be doing order entry. So you'll need to differentiate between those things. But if you have to provide a price and then there's some period after you provide that before they're probably going to close and actually do the business with you, you've got a sales process. So if you put that, let's call it quoting, as your middle, then it makes the beginning and end really easy for you because you say, okay, look, once I have everything I need to start putting a quote together, I'm in the quoting, I'm in the middle stage. But up until that point, I'm in the first stage. So all the way up until the client says, I've given you everything you need, and I agree I have everything I need to create a quote for you or an estimate or whatever, I'm in phase 1. And then once I get to the middle phase, once I'm done with the quote and I've submitted that to the customer, now I'm in the final phase. So it makes it crystal clear. Until I can create a quote, I'm in phase 1. While I'm creating the quote, I'm in phase 2. When I've submitted the quote for approval by the customer, I'm in phase 3. And you can see some other naming options for them. The other thing we suggest with your naming as you go through this is try to end things in an ing type of suffix, something that communicates that you're doing multiple things. We've seen people do something like, say, quote is the name of the middle phase. And it sounds like that's just something you get to, you kind of quickly check off and you move on to the next phase. But for most organizations, quoting probably means something like, hey, I've got to go maybe key information into a quoting system, or I've got to put a proposal together. Maybe I have an internal approval process to go through. Maybe a salesperson who wants to give a discount has to go through another type of internal approval process. And then finally, I can submit that quote to the customer for consideration. So the ing type of suffix helps to communicate that there are a number of activities going on within this phase that you need to take care of. Now, once you've defined those stage names, then, and this is on page 7 of your workbook, you can start to say, okay, I did some initial brainstorming. I did some more brainstorming as I thought about the luck principle, and now that I've named these stages, now I can kind of realign what my steps are within each of those stages with a little more accuracy because I have a little more definition around what beginning, middle, and end actually look like. So you take some time to actually align all those things in the proper categories. I'm going to pause here real briefly. I assume that many of you are probably using Dynamics CRM, but even if you're using something like Salesforce.com, these terms hold true. So as you think about defining your sales process, there's a lot of maybe new terminology. I just want to focus on 2. Within a sales process, typically you have stages at the top. So stages are something like quoting, where multiple things are taking place within a stage. And then within a stage, you might have 1 or more steps involved. So what you named your stages, those are the stages. All those little things you brainstormed under each stage, let's call those steps. So that kind of helps you to kind of have a common vernacular. So as we move into the next page of the workbook, you can start to think about, so how do I refine my steps a little bit in here? So you can go back to that page 7 and you can look at, hey, what else do I need to know about these stages? What other things can I put under here that I might want to bring together? And by the way, one of the things we really highly recommend, and you'll actually see this on page 8, the next steps of your workbook, is get a broad group of people involved in this. Give a lot of people a voice in brainstorming these things. That'll help you with buy-in, but that will also help you with discovering really the truth behind what the process looks like. So you might start with a smaller group, but then you might start bouncing this process off of other people before you commit to trying to automate it inside of your CRM tool. So take the time to refine your steps. And then on the top of page 6 of your workbook, one of the last things you want to think about for your first process is, what is your forecast for for each sales opportunity at the beginning of each stage? So what does that mean? What do these percentages mean? If you're new to this, that might kind of cause some angst. These are really how you measure the value of your pipeline. So let's say you have $100,000 all in the first stage of the pipeline, and you think you got about a 10% chance of winning something that's in the first phase, or more accurately, historically, you win about 10% of things that are in the first phase, but that percentage goes up over time. Now, a sales rep might say, I have a $100,000 pipeline right now. But someone who knows a little bit more about it might say, no, actually you have a $10,000 pipeline right now, because we know 90% of what you've got in that phase isn't going to make it to the last stage. Now, a question a lot of organizations ask us is, do we really need to put these forecast percentages in there? And the answer is, in the beginning, not necessarily, because probably they're a guess. If you've never done this before, you may not really know how many as a percent of each of these opportunities are ultimately going to be won. But ultimately, if you want to make decisions, particularly better decisions based on the pipeline, and not just see how much dollars is at what phase, then yes, you need to do this. Now, the pushback you might get is, well, we don't think, our pipeline doesn't work that way. We can't possibly predict this percentage. I would say that that is true maybe 1 or 2% of the time. And that's usually because you have a very few, very, very large items in your pipeline at once. And so it's really hard to predict how many of those are closed. Even in that situation, you should ultimately be able to do the calculation. But I was just consulting with a client the other week. They had about 1,200 opportunities that go through their pipeline every year. And they were insisting that there's no way we can predict based on these how they'll go. Sometimes they close, sometimes they don't, and there's not really a rhyme or reason to it. Once we actually started lining these up and saying, look, over time, we can now measure how many never make it past the first phase. That's your percentage of what's going to close and what's not. How many make it past or never make it past phase 2, and so on. And all of a sudden, they could start to say, wow, we really do close about a third of the things that enter phase 2 of our sales pipeline. We don't know which third. We can't predict them on a one-off basis, but we can pretty accurately say about a third of these close, and all of a sudden, the CFO and the COO can start making new cash flow predictions. They can start to predict demand and supply according to that demand based on what's coming into the sales pipeline. The folks who are doing this well are the folks who really understand this and start to actually predict sales better than they've ever predicted sales before. Now we're getting to the closing point here. I know we're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A. You may want to grab a snapshot of this page. This is actually, may look familiar to you. This is the luck principle again. But if you start to break this down into detail and say, how can we really map out each individual phase or stage of the process, you can map every single stage to the luck process. I'm not going to read through this. This is very detailed. But this is how great companies have actually been mapping out sales process for decades, actually, long before there were most of the modern CRM tools that there are now. They were managing this in Excel, or they were actually managing it just on paper if they needed to. But by going through and understanding each of these things and filling them out for each stage, this isn't a sheet you fill out for the whole sales process. You have a copy of this sheet for each stage of the sales process. You answer these questions. You align with the customer, as you'll see on some of these questions, and you can start to have a much more predictable, understandable sales process where the salespeople have the tools they need to get their jobs done more efficiently. So use this as a template as you're starting to design it. This is a little more detailed. You may not want to jump directly into this, but it really does help you think through all the different things you need to think through at each stage of the sales process. So I hope you find that helpful. A few other tools for you. If you, for some reason, joined us late or weren't able to get the workbook is free. You can download it at our website. There's the link at the top of the page. Print as many copies of it as you want. There's also, if you like the idea of luck is really a framework, a set of disciplines that the best companies are doing to become more people-centric in the digital age. So if you want something that's an easy read to kind of flip through and start to think a little bit more strategically about how do I align my CRM solution with a more people-centric way of approaching our customers and working together better internally, that's a great quick read for you. If you want to dive deeper into sales process design, at the end of May or mid-May, I think, we actually have a 2-day CRM workshop coming up where about half of one of those days is focused just on interactively working together to develop a sales process design. Great thing to bring people from different teams together around. And there's also other things in there like better change management, CRM governance. It's a non-technical workshop meant more for project management leadership for CRM projects. So, and there's a bit more about C5 Insight and what we do over there on the side. I'd love to connect with you guys. I'm about to open it up for questions, so if you have some, now's a good time to key them in or do the raising your hand thing. But while you're doing that, there's my contact information. I love hearing from folks, even if it's just a quick question. Maybe you didn't want to ask it here, or maybe it comes up afterwards. Shoot it to me as an email. So it's what I do. I go all over the country speaking and writing on these things, and I love being able to connect with people on these. So thank you so much for coming today. And Suzanne, are there any questions?
We have a couple here today, Jeff. Maybe if you could just recap or share some best tips just to get started, right? I mean, who do you bring in the room?
Sure, great question. So who do you bring in the room and what are some other tips? So yeah, first of all, you want the people who have to execute the process in the room with you. So the wrong people in the room are technology people and executive leadership people. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be in the room, but if that's all that's in the room, it's kind of a recipe for disaster. And even sales management in the room without sales reps can be a disaster because somebody needs to be there that's familiar with the practical realities of what they're doing. So partner, if this is mostly an IT audience, that's great that you're here and you want to do this well. Partner with your reps and ideally get a representative sample of a few reps, maybe a manager, maybe an executive, and you all together mapping this out. The other tip is, it's just always true, is keep it simple. We do about 60% of the work we do is rescuing failed CRM, failed sales process projects. And what I can tell you is I have rarely had to be involved in rescuing a project that was oversimplified or that was under-engineered. But I have frequently had to rescue projects that were over-engineered, that were too complex, that added too many steps and were difficult for people to understand or had a lot of fields on forms. So again, cringe because you've kept it simple. don't cringe because you might be making it a little bit too complex. It's almost impossible to reel in complexity. It is very easy to take something that's too simple and make it a little more complex. And along those lines, I would say the 3-stage approach is probably the best one to go with to start with. A couple other things I think about that I run into pretty frequently with sales processes: make sure that your the process stages really are around the opportunity. So in other words, I see a lot of organizations say, we're going to have an account management stage. Well, that might be necessary, but that's really around the account entity, not around the opportunity entity. So that gets confusing for people when they say, well, gosh, I'm managing every account, so I guess I need an opportunity for every single one with that stage in there. So be careful about making those kinds of mistakes with it.
Great. What do you believe are some of the primary obstacles to implementing a sales process? What have you seen?
Great question. So I think the biggest one, I don't have statistical evidence for this, but one of the ones I run into most frequently is trying to do a sales process before the organization is really ready for a sales process. So I run into this in a lot of organizations where they get a CRM solution, they're excited about it, including their sales team is excited about it. They see how sales process works in it. That looks really exciting, but they've never done sales process before. They've never managed their pipeline before. There's a lot of organizations out there that do good activity management and proactively stay in front of their customers, but this idea of pipeline management is brand new to them. And when companies try to do CRM and pipeline management both at the same time, I'm not sure if I can think of a single time that has ended well. It usually always ends in failure because it's too much change too fast. So that absolutely gets in the way of success with it. Another thing that's kind of on the back end that a lot of organizations really lose is this is an organic, growing, changing thing. So setting up a sales process isn't something you go into a room, you spend some time brainstorming, you roll it out and give people training, and then it stays the same for a long period of time. It really needs to be a fluid part of your sales management process, and not necessarily your CRM governance, although there's certainly an overlap there. But I see a lot of organizations say, well, we'll have a CRM governance team that meets to discuss this, but really your sales, your revenue generation team, part of their cadence of regular meetings should be, what are we learning from the process, and what should we modify about this process based on what we're learning? So it's not, those aren't meetings specifically about CRM. Those are meetings about individual productivity, individual success rates, and ultimately part of the feedback coming out of those should go to a CRM steering committee that then says, okay, let's embrace these things and add these things to the solution. And I see a lot of organizations just kind of set it up and then kind of get people to use it or hope people will use it and never really have that ongoing cadence giving all the users a voice and making improvements. That's really important.
Yeah, good points. All right, I don't think we have any more questions today, so if you think of anything later, again, you can reach out to Jeff directly or send your feedback or questions to info@archerpoint.com. I want to thank everybody for their time today. Hope you consider it time well spent, and we look forward to seeing you on our next Lunch and Learn webinar.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jeff. This concludes today's session. Have a great rest of your day.